45. Parkins Gillespie was standing on the small covered porch of the municipal building, smoking a Pall Mall and looking out at the western sky. He turned his attention to Ben Mears and Mark Petrie reluctantly. His face looked sad and old, like the glasses of water they bring you in cheap diners. "How are you, Constable?" Ben asked. "Tolerable," Parkins allowed. He considered a hangnail on the leathery arc of skin that bordered his thumbnail. "See you trucking back and forth? Looked like the kid was driving up from the railroad street by himself last time. That so?" "Yes," Mark said. "Almost got clipped. Fella going the other way missed you by a horse hair." "Constable," Ben said, "we want to tell you what's been happening around here." Parkins Gillespie spat out the stub of his cigarette without raising his hands from the rail of the small covered porch. Without looking at either of them, he said calmly, "I don't want to hear it." They looked at him dumbfounded. "Nolly didn't show up today," Parkins said, still in that calm, conversational voice. "Somehow, I don't think he will. He called in late last night and said he'd seen Homer McCaslin's car out on the Deep Cut road. I think it was the Deep Cut, he said. He never called back in." Slowly, sadly, like a man underwater, he dipped into his shirt pocket and reached another Pall Mall out of it. He rolled it reflectively between his thumb and finger. "These fucking things are going to be the death of me," he said. Ben tried again. "The man who took the Marsden house, Gillespie. His name is Barlow. He's in the basement of Ava Miller's boarding house right now." "That's so," Parkins said, with no particular surprise. "Vampire, ain't he? Just like in all the comic books they used to put out 20 years ago." Ben said nothing. He felt more and more like a man lost in a great grinding nightmare, where clockwork ran on and on endlessly unseen, but just below the surface of things. "I'm leaving town," Parkins said. "Got my stuff all packed up in the back of the car. I left my gun and the bubble and my badge in on the shelf. I'm done with Lauren. Going to see my sister in Kittery, I am. Figure that's far enough to be safe." Ben heard himself say remotely, "You gutless creep. You coward piece of shit. This town is still alive and you're running from it." "It ain't alive," Parkins said, lighting his smoke with a wooden kitchen match. "That's why he came here. It's dead, like him. Has been for 20 years or more. Whole country's going the same way. Me and Nolly went to a drive-in show up in Falmouth a couple of weeks ago, just before they closed her down for the season. I seen more blood and killing in that first western than I seen in both years in Korea. Kids was eating popcorn and cheering 'em on." He gestured vaguely at the town, now lying unnaturally gilded in the broken rays of the westering sun, like a dream village. "They probably like being vampires, but not me. Nolly'd be in after me tonight. I'm going." Ben looked at him helplessly. "You two fellas want to get in that car and hit out of here," Parkins said. "This town will go on without us. For a while. Then it won't matter." Yes, Ben thought. Why don't we do that? Mark spoke the reason for both of them. "Because he's bad, mister. He's really bad, that's all." "Is that so?" Parkins said. He nodded and puffed his Pall Mall. "Well, okay." He looked up towards the consolidated high school. Piss-poor attendance today from the lot anyway. Buses running late, kids out sick, office phoning houses and not getting any answer. The attendance officer called me and I soothed him some. He's a funny little bald-headed fella who thinks he knows what he's doing. Well, the teachers are there anyway. They come from out of town mostly. They can teach each other. Thinking of Matt, Ben said. "Not all of them are from out of town." "It don't matter," Parkins said. His eyes dropped to the stakes in Ben's belt. "You gonna try and do that fella up with one of those?" "Yes." "You can have my riot gun if you want it. That gun. It was Nolly's idea. Nolly liked to go armed, he did. Not even a bank in town so as he could hope someone would rob it. He'll make a good vampire, though, once he gets the hang of it." Mark was looking at him with rising horror, and Ben knew he had to get him away. This was the worst of all. "Come on," he said to Mark. "He's done." "I guess that's it," Parkins said. His pale, crinkle-caught eyes surveyed the town. "Surely is quiet. I seen Mabel Wirtz peeking out with her glasses, but I don't see there's much to peek at today. There'll be more tonight, likely." They went back to the car. It was almost 5:30. 46. They pulled up in front of St. Andrew's at 6:15. Lengthening shadows fell from the church across the street to the rectory, covering it like a prophecy. Ben pulled Jimmy's bag out of the back seat and dumped it out. He found several small ampoules and dumped their contents out of the window, saving the bottles. "What are you doing?" "We're going to put holy water in these," Ben said. "Come on." They went up to the church and climbed the steps. Mark, about to open the middle door, paused and pointed. Look at that. The handle was blackened and pulled slightly out of shape, as if a heavy electric charge had been pushed through it. Does that mean anything to you? Ben asked. No, but... Mark shook his head, pushing an unformed thought away. He opened the door and then went in. The church was cool and grey, and filled with the endless pregnant pause that all empty altars of faith, white and black, have in common. The 2 ranks of pews were split by a wide central aisle, and flanking this, 2 plaster angels stood cradling bowls of holy water, their calm and sweetly knowing faces bent as if to catch their own reflections in the still water. Ben put the ampoules in his pocket. Bathe your face and hands, he said. Mark looked at him, troubled. That's sacrilege. Not this time. Go ahead. They dunked their hands in the still water and splashed it over their faces, the way a man who just wakened will splash cold water into his eyes to shock the world back into them. Ben took the first ampoule out of his pocket and was filling it when a shrill voice cried, Here now! What are you doing? Ben turned around. It was Rhoda Curless, Father Callahan's housekeeper, who had been sitting in the first pew and twisting a rosary helplessly between her fingers. She was wearing a black dress, and her slip hung below the hem. Her hair was in disarray. She had been pulling her fingers through it. Where's the father? What are you doing? Her voice was reedy and thin, close to hysteria. Who are you? Ben asked. Mrs. Curless, I'm Father Callahan's housekeeper. Where's the father? What are you doing? Her hands came together and began to war with each other. Father Callahan is gone, Ben said, as gently as he could. Oh. She closed her eyes. Was he getting after whatever ails this town? Yes, Ben said. I knew it, she said. I didn't have to ask. He's a strong, good man of the cloth. There were always those who said he'd never be man enough to fill Father Bergeron's shoes, but he filled them. They were too small for him, as it turns out. She opened her eyes wide and looked at them. A tear spilled from her left and ran down her cheek. He won't be back, will he? I don't know, Ben said. They talked about his drinking, she said, as though she hadn't heard. Was there ever an Irish priest worth his keep who didn't tip the bottle? None of that mollycoddling, wet nursing, church bingo prayer basket for him. He was more than that. Her voice rose toward a vaulting ceiling in a hoarse, almost challenging cry. He was a priest, not some holy alderman. Ben and Mark listened without speech or surprise. There was no surprise left on this dream-struck day. There was not even the capacity for it. They no longer saw themselves as doers or avengers or saviours. The day had absorbed them. Helplessly, they were only living. Was he strong when you last saw him? She demanded, peering at them. The tears magnified the gimlet lack of compromise in her eyes. Yes, Mark said, remembering Callahan in his mother's kitchen holding his cross aloft. And are you about his work now? Yes, Mark said again. Then be about it, she snapped at them. What are you waiting for? And she left them, walking down the centre aisle in her black dress, the solitary mourner at a funeral that hadn't been held here. 47. Ava's again, and at the last. It was 10 minutes after 6. The sun hung over the western pines, peering out of the broken clouds like blood. Ben drove into the parking lot and looked curiously up at his room. The shade was not drawn, and he could see his typewriter standing sentinel, and beside it, his pile of manuscript and the glass globe paperweight on top of it. It seemed amazing that he could see all those things from here, see them clearly, as if everything in the world was sane and normal and ordered. He let his eyes drop to the back porch. The rocking chairs where he and Susan had shared their first kiss stood side by side unchanged. The door which gave ingress to the kitchen stood open as Mark had left it. I can't, he muttered. I just can't. His eyes were wide and white. He had drawn up his knees and was now crouched on the seat. It's got to be both of us, Ben said. He held out 2 of the ampoules filled with holy water. Mark twitched away from them in horror, as if touching them would admit poison through his skin. Come on, Ben said. He had no arguments left. Come on, come on. No. Mark, no. Mark, I need you. You and me, that's all that's left. I've done enough, Mark cried. I can't do any more. Can't you understand? I can't look at him. Mark, it has to be the 2 of us. Don't you know that? Mark took the ampoules and curled them slowly against his chest. Oh boy, he whispered. Oh boy, oh boy. He looked at Ben and nodded. The movement of his head was jerky and agonized. Okay, he said. Where's the hammer? He asked as they got out. Jimmy had it. Okay. They walked up the porch steps in the strengthening wind. The sun glared red through the clouds, dyeing everything. Inside, in the kitchen, the stink of death was palpable and wet, pressing against them like granite. The cellar door stood open. "I'm so scared," Mark said, shuddering. "You better be. Where's that flashlight?" "In the cellar. I left it when—" "Okay." They stood at the mouth of the cellar. As Mark had said, the stairs looked intact in the sunset light. "Follow me," Ben said. 48. Ben thought quite easily, "I'm going to my death." The thought came naturally, and there was no fear or regret in it. Inward-turning emotions were lost under the overwhelming atmosphere of evil that hung over the place. As he slipped and scraped his way down the board Mark had set up to get out of the cellar, all he felt was an unnatural glacial calm. He saw that his hands were glowing, as if wreathed in ghost gloves. It did not surprise him. Let be finale of seam. The only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. Who had said that? Matt? Matt was dead. Susan was dead. Miranda was dead. Wallace Stevens was dead too. I wouldn't look at that if I were you. But he had looked, and that's what you looked like when it was over. Like something smashed and broken that had been filled with different coloured fluids. It wasn't so bad. Not so bad as his death. Jimmy had been carrying McCaslin's pistol. It would still be in his coat pocket. He would take it, and if the sunset came before they could get to Barlow, first the boy, then himself. Not good, but better than his death. He dropped to the cellar floor and then helped Mark down. The boy's eyes flashed to the dark, curled thing on the floor and then skipped away. "I can't look at it," he said huskily. "That's all right." Mark turned away and Ben knelt down. He swept away a number of the lethal plywood squares, the knife blades thrust through them glittering like dragon's teeth. Gently then, he turned Jimmy over. "I wouldn't look at that if I were you." "Oh, Jimmy," he tried to say, and the words broke open and bled in his throat. He cradled Jimmy in the curve of his left arm and pulled Barlow's blades out of him with his right hand. There were 6 of them, and Jimmy had bled a great deal. There was a neatly folded stack of living room drapes on a corner shelf. He took them over to Jimmy and spread them over his body after he had the gun and the flashlight and the hammer. He stood up and tried the flashlight. The plastic lens cover had cracked, but the bulb still worked. He flashed it around. Nothing. He shone it under the pool table. Bare. Nothing behind the furnace, racks of preserves, and a pegboard hung with tools. The amputated stairs, pushed over in the far corner so they would be out of sight from the kitchen. They looked like a scaffold leading nowhere. "Where is he?" Ben muttered. He glanced at his watch, and the hands stood at 6:23. When was sunset? He couldn't remember. Surely no later than 6:55. That gave them a bare half hour. "Where is he?" he cried out. "I can feel him, but where is he?" "There!" Mark cried, pointing with one glowing hand. "What's that?" Ben centered the light on it, a Welsh dresser. "It's not big enough," he said to Mark, "and it's flush against the wall. Let's look behind it." Ben shrugged. They crossed the room to the Welsh dresser and took each side. He felt a trickle of building excitement. Surely the odour or aura or atmosphere or whatever you wanted to call it was thicker here, more offensive. Ben glanced up at the kitchen door. The light was dimmer now. The gold was fading out of it. "It's too heavy for me," Mark panted. "Never mind," Ben said. "We're going to tip it over. Get your best hold." Mark bent over it, his shoulder against the wood. His eyes looked fiercely out of his glowing face. "Okay." They threw their combined weight against it, and the Welsh dresser went over with a bone-like crash as Ava Miller's long-ago wedding china shattered inside. "I knew it!" Mark cried triumphantly. There was a small door chest-high set into the wall where the Welsh dresser had been. A new Yale padlock secured the hasp. 2 hard swings of the hammer convinced him that the lock wasn't going to give. "Jesus Christ," he muttered softly. Frustration welled up bitterly in his throat. To be balked like this at the end. Balked by a $5 padlock. No, he would bite through the wood with his teeth if he had to. He shone the flashlight around, and its beam fell on the neatly hung toolboard to the right of the stairs. Hung on 2 of its steel pegs was an axe with a rubber cover masking its blade. He ran across, snatched it off the pegboard, and pulled the rubber cover off the blade. He took one of the ampoules from his pocket and dropped it. The holy water ran out onto the floor, beginning to glow immediately. He got another one, twisted the cap off, and doused the blade of the axe. It began to glimmer with eldritch fairy light. And when he set his hands on the wooden haft, the grip felt incredibly good, incredibly right. Power seemed to have welded his flesh into its present grip. He stood holding it for a moment, looking at the shining blade, and some curious impulse made him touch it to his forehead. A hard sense of sureness clasped him, a feeling of inevitable rightness, of whiteness. For the first time in weeks, he felt he was no longer groping through fogs of belief and unbelief, sparring with a partner whose body was too insubstantial to sustain blows. Power humming up his arms like volts. The blade glowed brighter. "Do it," Mark pleaded. "Quick, please." Then Mears spread his feet, slung the axe back, and brought it down in a gleaming arc that left an after-image on the eye. The blade bit the wood with a booming, portentous sound, and sung to the haft. Splinters flew. He pulled it out, the wood screaming against the steel. He brought it back down again. He could feel the muscles of his back and arms flexing and meshing, moving with a sureness and a studied heat that they had never known before. Each blow sent chips and splinters like flying shrapnel. On the fifth blow, the blade crashed through to emptiness, and he began hacking the hole wider with a speed that approached frenzy. Mark stared at him, amazed. The cold blue fire had crept down the axe handle and spread up his arms until he seemed to be working in a column of fire. His head was twisted to one side, the muscles of his neck corded with strain. One eye open, glaring, the other eye squeezed shut. The back of his shirt had split between the straining wings of his shoulder blades, and the muscles writhed beneath the skin like ropes. He was a man taken over, possessed, and Mark saw without knowing, or having to know, that the possession was not in the least Christian. The good was more elemental, less refined. It was ore, like something coughed up out of the ground in naked chunks. There was nothing finished about it. It was force. It was power. It was whatever moved the greatest wheels of the universe. The door to Ava Miller's root cellar could not stand before it. The axe began to move at a nearly blinding speed. It became a ripple, a descending arc, a rainbow from over Ben's shoulder to the splintered wood of the final door. He dealt it a final blow and slung the axe away. He held his hands up before his eyes. They blazed. He held them out to Mark, and the boy flinched. "I love you," Ben said. They clasped hands. 49. The root cellar was small and cell-like, except for a few dusty bottles, some crates, and a dusty bushel basket of very old potatoes that were sprouting eyes in every direction, and the bodies. Barlow's coffin stood at the far end, propped against the wall like a mummy's sarcophagus, and the crest on it blazed coldly in the light they carried with them like St. Elmo's fire. In front of the coffin, leading up to it like railroad ties, were the bodies of the people Ben had lived with and broken bread with. Ava Miller and Weasel Craig beside her, Mabe Mullican from the room at the end of the second-floor hall, John Snow, who had been on the county and could barely walk down to the breakfast table with his arthritis, Vinnie Upshaw, Grover Verrill. They stepped over them and stood by the coffin. Ben glanced down at his watch. It was 6:40. "We're going to take it out of here," he said, "by Jimmy." "It must weigh a ton," Mark said. "We can do it." He reached out almost tentatively and then grasped the upper right corner of the coffin. The crest glittered like an impassioned eye. The wood was crawlingly unpleasant to the touch, smooth and stone-like with years. There seemed to be no pores in the wood. No small imperfections for the fingers to recognize and mold to, yet it rocked easily. One hand did it. He tipped it forward with a small push, feeling the great weight held in check as if by invisible counterweights. Something thumped inside. Ben took the weight of the coffin in one hand. "Now," he said, "your end." Mark lifted, and the end of the coffin came easily. The boy's face filled with pleased amazement. "I think I could do it with one finger." "You probably could. Things are finally running our way, but we have to be quick." They carried the coffin through the shattered door. It threatened to stick at its widest point, and Mark lowered his head and shoved. It went through with a wooden scream. They carried it across to where Jimmy lay, covered with Ava Miller's drapes. "Here he is, Jimmy," Ben said. "Here the bastard is. Set it down, Mark." He glanced at his watch again, 6:45. Now the light coming through the kitchen door above them was an ashy grey. "Now?" Mark asked. They looked at each other over the coffin. "Yes," Ben said. Mark came around, and they stood together in front of the coffin's locks and seals. They bent together, and the locks split as they touched them, making a sound like thin, snapping clapboards. They lifted. Barlow lay before them, his eyes glaring upward. He was a young man now, his black hair vibrant and lustrous, flowing over the satin pillow at the end of his narrow apartment. His skin glowed with life. The cheeks were as ruddy as wine. His teeth curved out over his full lips, white with strong streaks of yellow like ivory. Mark began and never finished. Barlow's red eyes rolled in their sockets, filling with hideous life and mocking triumph. They locked with Mark's eyes, and Mark gaped down into them, his own eyes growing blank and far away. "Don't look at him!" Ben cried, but it was too late. He knocked Mark away. The boy whined deep in his throat and suddenly attacked Ben. Taken by surprise, Ben staggered backward. A moment later, the boy's hands were in his coat pocket, digging for Homer McCaslin's pistol. "Mark, don't!" But the boy didn't hear. His face was as blank as a washed blackboard. The whining went on in his throat, the sound of a very small trapped animal. He had both hands around the pistol. They struggled for it, Ben trying to rip it from the boy's grasp and keep it pointed away from both of them. "Mark!" he bellowed. "Mark, wake up! For Christ's sake!" The muzzle jerked down toward his head and the gun went off. He felt the slug pass by his temple. He wrapped his hands around Mark's and kicked out with one foot. Mark staggered backward and the gun clattered on the floor between them. The boy leapt at it, whining, and Ben punched him in the mouth with all the strength he had. He felt the boy's lips mash back against his teeth and cried out as if he himself had been hit. Mark slipped to his knees and Ben kicked the gun away. Mark tried to go after it, crawling, and Ben hit him again. With a tired sigh, the boy collapsed. The strength had left him now, and the sureness. He was only Ben Mears again, and he was afraid. The square of light in the kitchen doorway had faded to thin purple. His watch said 6:51. A huge force seemed to be dragging at his head, commanding him to look at the rosy, gorged parasite in the coffin beside him. "Look and see me, puny man. Look upon Barlow, who has passed the centuries as you have passed hours before a fireplace with a book. Look and see the great creature of the night, whom you would slay with your miserable little stick. Look upon me, scribbler. I have written in human lives, and blood has been my ink. Look upon me and despair." "Jimmy, I can't do it. It's too late. He's too strong for me." "Look at me." It was 6:53. Mark groaned on the floor. "Mom? Mama? Where are you? My head hurts. It's dark." "He shall enter my service castratum." Ben fumbled one of the stakes from his belt and dropped it. He cried out miserably in utter despair. Outside, the sun had deserted Jerusalem's lot. Its last rays lingered on the roof of the Marsden house. He snatched the stake up, but where was the hammer? Where was the fucking hammer? By the root cellar door. He had swung at the padlock with it. He scrambled across the cellar and picked it up where it lay. Mark was half sitting, his mouth a bloody gash. He wiped a hand across it and looked dazedly at the blood. "Mama!" he cried. "Where's my mother?" 6:55 now. Light and darkness hung perfectly balanced. Ben ran back across the darkening cellar, the stake clutched in his left hand, the hammer in his right. There was a booming, triumphant laugh. Barlow was sitting up in his coffin, those red eyes flashing with hellish triumph. They locked with Ben's, and he felt the will draining away from him. With a mad, convulsive yell, he raised the stake over his head and brought it down in a whistling arc. Its razored point sheared through Barlow's shirt, and he felt it strike into the flesh beneath. Barlow screamed. It was an eerie, hurt sound, like the howl of a wolf. The force of the stake slamming home drove him back into the coffin on his back. His hands rose out of it, hooked into claws, waving crazily. Ben brought the hammer down on the top of the stake, and Barlow screamed again. One of his hands, as cold as the grave, seized Ben's left hand, which locked around the stake. Ben wriggled into the coffin, his knees planted on Barlow's knees. He stared down into the hate and pain-driven face. "Let me go!" Barlow cried. "Here it comes, you bastard," Ben sobbed. "Here it is, leech. Here it is for you." He brought the hammer down again. Blood splashed upward in a cold gush, blinding him momentarily. Barlow's head lashed from side to side on the satin pillow. "Let me go! You dare not! You dare not! You dare not do this!" He brought the hammer down again and again. Blood burst from Barlow's nostrils. His body began to jerk in the coffin like a stabbed fish. The hands clawed at Ben's cheeks, pulling long gouges in the skin. "Let me go!" He brought the hammer down on the stake once more, and the blood that pulsed from Barlow's chest turned black. Then, dissolution. It came in the space of 2 seconds, too fast to ever be believed in the daylight of later years, yet slow enough to recur again and again in nightmares, with awful stop-motion slowness. The skin yellowed, coarsened, blistered like old sheets of canvas. The eyes faded, filmed white, fell in. The hair went white and fell like a drift of feathers. The body inside the dark suit shriveled and retreated. The mouth widened gapingly as the lips drew back, meeting the nose and disappearing in an oral ring of jutting teeth. The fingernails went black and peeled off, and then there were only bones, still dressed with rings, clinking and clenching like castanets. Dust puffed through the fibres of the linen shirt. The bald and wrinkled head became a skull. The pants, with nothing left to fill them out, fell away to broomsticks clad in black silk. For a moment, a hideously animated scarecrow writhed beneath him, and Ben lunged out of the coffin with a strangled cry of horror. But it was impossible to tear the gaze away from Barlow's last metamorphosis. It hypnotized. The fleshless skull whipped from side to side on the satin pillow. The nude jawbone opened in a soundless scream that had no vocal cords to power it. The skeletal fingers danced and clicked on the dark air like marionettes. Smells struck his nose and then vanished, each in a light little puff. Gas, putrescence, horrid and fleshy, a mouldy library smell, acrid dust. Then, nothing. The twisting, protesting finger bones shredded and flaked away like pencils. The nasal cavity of the skull widened and met the oral cavity. The empty eye sockets widened in a fleshless expression of surprise and horror, met and were no more. The skull caved in like an ancient Ming vase. The clothes settled flat and became as neutral as dirty laundry. And still there was no end to its tenacious hold on the world. Even the dust billowed and writhed in tiny dust devils within the coffin. And then, suddenly, he felt the passage of something which buffeted past him like a strong wind, making him shudder. At the same instant, every window of Ava Miller's boarding house blew outward. "Look out, Ben!" Mark screamed. "Look out!" He whirled over on his back and saw them coming out of the root cellar. Ava, Weasel, Mabe, Grover, and the others. Their time was on the world. Mark's screams echoed in his ears like great fire bells, and he grabbed the boy by the shoulders. "The holy water!" he yelled into Mark's tormented face. "They can't touch us!" Mark's cries turned to whimpers. "Go up the board," Ben said. "Go on!" He had to turn the boy to face it, and then slap his bottom to make him climb. When he was sure the boy was going up, he turned back and looked at them, the undead. They were standing passively some 15 feet away, looking at him with flat hate that was not human. "You killed the master," Ava said, and he could almost believe there was grief in her voice. "How could you kill the master?" "I'll be back," he told her, "for all of you." He went up the board, climbing bent over, using his hands. It groaned under his weight, but held. At the top, he spared one glance back down. They were gathered around the coffin now, looking in silently. They reminded him of the people who had entered around Miranda's body after the accident with the moving van. He looked around for Mark and saw him lying by the porch door on his face. 50. Ben told himself that the boy had just fainted, and nothing more. It might be true. His pulse was strong and regular. He gathered him in his arms and carried him out to the Citroen. He got behind the wheel and started the engine. As he pulled out onto Railroad Street, delayed reaction struck him like a physical blow. He had to stifle a scream. They were in the streets, the walking dead. Cold and hot, his head full of a wild roaring sound, he turned left on Jointer Avenue and drove out of Salem's lot.